Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unit 4.2 Exploration Causes and Events 1450 to 1750. So, in this lecture, we're actually not going to do the entirety of the section. We're only going to take a look at the main ideas of it and look at two case studies, specifically looking at Portugal and Spain. Now, don't worry, we're going to look at the others as well, but we're going to do that more specifically. We're going to look at those others like Britain, France, and the Dutch a little bit later on, so we can kind of space this out a little bit, just like we did with the spice charts for those various empires. All right, so the key concept here is that you have new state-supported transoceanic maritime exploration occurred in this period, and this is something that's building off of what we just talked about in 4.1 with the technological innovations allowing that to take place. So let's get started. All right, so the first thing you have to think of is you have to think of the roles of states, because the essential question is looking at state-supported exploration. So what role do the states actually play? And remember, voyages were very expensive if you didn't have state sponsorship, and they weren't possible without it because of what actually needed to go into it. So you needed money, and the states were really the only powerful entity that could provide that in Europe at the time. And here's what the states wanted. First off, they wanted new wealth to be brought back by taxes and trading opportunity for any number of reasons, but basically they could at least make up the expense of that voyage. They also wanted new material wealth, and the big key one here, specifically for the Spanish, is silver. And we'll get into some activities talking about really that effect and impact silver is going to have once that's found in the New World and how it gets exchanged backwards, specifically with Spain. They also wanted to expand before their other European rivals, and this is going to be something that you guys are going to see throughout this unit, whether it's between the Portuguese and the Spanish initially, or it's between the other European powers. And as we address different topics moving forward, as this period continues, and then we go into period 5, you're going to see these rivalries take shape and explode into open conflict and open argumentation and so forth. So that's that. And then also it's to spread Christianity. And remember, all these groups are Christian, and they thought it was their duty to spread Christianity and convert those. All right. So basically, this is what you're looking at. You have growth in exploration and maritime trade. And what are the inputs coming in? Well, you have religious minorities are facing persecution and want a place where their dissent is tolerated. So, for example, if you look at the Edict of Nantes and you have the French Protestants or the Huguenots were wanting a religious freedom, and their religious freedom had been revoked. Or you eventually look at, like in American history, we think of the Puritans or the Pilgrims moving over and into Plymouth Rock. There's also a desire for adventure and glory and riches, and this is going to be primarily the main driving focus behind the explorers, as well as many others. You have primogeniture laws that are giving land just to the first sons, and they get everything, so the later sons want to actually find something for themselves. So the European social structure is actually pushing people to explore and or trade. And then you have population pressures in Europe as the population in Europe is growing after the Black Death and the Renaissance and so forth. They need to relieve those pressures. So those are the inputs into this growth in exploration and trade, or at least some of them. All right, so let's look at the role of sovereign states in this maritime exploration a little bit more closely. So if you remember, in the early Renaissance period, you have all these various Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa and so forth that are actually on the Mediterranean or Adriatic, and they're controlling the trade between Asia and Europe. And there's that middleman. And remember, the middleman here is not only the Italian city-states, but it's also the Middle Eastern Islamic states as well. So there's that controlling of trade, and this meant that Asian goods and their prices were higher in European markets. And this monopoly, or at least this higher trading price that Europeans didn't want to pay, made them very angry. And the first two to actually really respond to that are Portugal and Spain. And they ultimately want to find their own route to Asia. And this is what's going to drive them to ultimately like the Portuguese with Vasco da Gama, where he ends up rounding the Cape of Good Hope and getting to India, like we've talked about previously. All right, so here's some further other aims and stuff or roles of these sovereign states. You have the rivalry, like we talked about just a couple of slides ago, and then this slogan that you guys have to remember. It's gold, God, and glory, or I like to say it is God, glory, and gold. But it doesn't really matter what order as long as you remember those three G's. And then we're back to our friend Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, and we've read about him in comparison with Zheng He, if you guys remember that. And Prince Henry was somebody that was very, very forward thinking in his time. And we know that he wasn't directly a sailor, even though his nickname suggests so, but he was somebody that was aware of the possible profits in not only West Africa or North Africa because of Portugal's closeness to the Saharan trade routes, but also because of their technology. He wanted to, he was somebody that was a big supporter of that, a patron of the navigational technology and exploration routes. And because of this, Portugal is going to become really our true first navigational or maritime empire. And he makes them the center of this technological kind of renaissance in exploration and in sailing. And this is where it first takes off in Europe. Now, these early voyages actually for the Portuguese go down the western coast of Africa, and this is ultimately what actually leads to the enslavement of Africans. So this is going to become the early days of what are going to be known eventually as the Atlantic slave trade. And as more exploration and all this stuff expands, we're going to see this slave trade take off, and we'll address that more later in a lot of activities in detail. Now, as the 15th century or the 1400s progress, you see the Portuguese explorers moving further and further down the Atlantic coast or west coast of Africa. And this is where you ultimately see by the 1480s and 1490s, they're getting very close to the Cape of Good Hope, and then ultimately rounding it and getting to the eastern coast of Africa and then across to India. And again, the aim is to find that sea route to Asia. All right, so the next thing we need to talk about is mercantilism. And mercantilism is where wealth and power of a country is measured in the amount of gold and silver or other tangible material wealth they have. And basically, you see states set up policies to sell as many goods as possible so they can maximize their profits in those materials, such as gold and silver. Again, big example here in your notes, silver for Spain, and then its connection to China. We'll do some activities on that. And then the other part of it is they want to buy as little as possible from other countries. So the basic situation here economically is they want as much material wealth as possible, such as gold and or silver, and they want to become self-sufficient. Okay, because if they're not self-sufficient, then they have to give resources to their rivals. Okay, so this means that there's an economic-driven conflict there, or the possibility for one, and then also you need heavy government involvement. All right, so this is basically what you're seeing as mercantilism, and it goes hand in hand with colonization. So as we progress through this period and we look at the various states, such as Portugal and Spain, and the similarities and differences there, or we look at Britain and France, or Britain and the Dutch, colonization is actually going to be the one driving factor that's going to allow specifically the Spanish and the English to ultimately take this idea of mercantilism to the next level. And we'll get into that as we move along. But you can see in this graphic on screen, this is the actual European view of mercantilism and what it's supposed to be. And the idea here is this balance of trade. And the balance of trade is not technically actually a balance. It's that you actually are exporting more than you are importing, therefore you're making money, and it gives you bigger treasury. Okay, and you can see it here in terms of what the colonies are supposed to work for you. Colonies give you resources, mother country turns it into manufactured goods, and then they are sold either back to the colonies or to other countries. All right, so now we're going to look at our first of two case studies here for this first half of 4.2. We're going to look at Portugal. And remember, Portugal, they have the development in maritime technology and navigational skills that is not only going to lead to their expansion of trade and travel from to Africa and then Asia, but and them creating a global trading post empire. But this is actually going to allow others to kind of take off as well. So they're going to kind of be the forerunners of all of this, and then people are going to follow. All right. So remember, I've already mentioned Vasco da Gama several times. We've talked about him earlier in this course. Remember, he leaves Europe in 1497. He sails down the coast of Africa, and then once he gets to the Cape of Good Hope, he is actually able to round it and then comes in contact with the Swahili city-states of East Africa. Now, once there, they realize the trading abilities here, and then they use their technology, specifically cannon, to ultimately control this area of the East African coast. And we're going to see the Portuguese influence there last, even to this day, but they're actually going to control the East African coast until 1960. So this is going to be a long-lasting relationship that is going to be built from an empire standpoint here with Vasco da Gama coming in contact with the East African city-states or the Swahili city-states. Okay, and then eventually he's going to make his way across the Indian Ocean to Calicut and establish a trading link with Asia there. All right, so now more with the Portuguese. And the Portuguese are going to set up a trading post empire. So it's going to be a little bit different than what we're going to see, like what you think with the Portuguese, or excuse me, the Spanish or the British. And their aim is they want to control the Indian Ocean trade. They want a monopoly on the spice trade. That's their goal. And they're able to at least achieve that for a short period of time. And remember, the Portuguese here, when they enter into the Indian Ocean trade, like we talked about in Unit 2, they're going to end that mutual trade system that was existing in the period that we were talking about previously in this course. So the Portuguese are going to end that, and they're going to be able to take advantages of the different rivalries that are existing in specifically in India at this time, where you have Hindus against Muslims, and the Portuguese can establish forts and then play them off each other for their own benefit, specifically economically and controlling the trade. Okay, and it's not only just in India itself. We see it in Arabia, we see it in Egypt, and so forth, that the Portuguese are able to do this in this whole area. Okay, and this is also going to mark the beginning of European colonial dominance in Asia. Now, eventually what will happen is it's going to transition from the Portuguese to the Dutch, and then to a conflict between the British and the French, and then the British will gain control. But the idea here is that once you see certain actions take place, such as the Second Battle of Diu in 1538, you actually see Portuguese hegemony in the Indian Ocean. Make sure you know this word. It's very important in understanding what hegemony means. All right, just a few more here. So we're going to take a look at also in the early part of the 1500s, the Portuguese are going to extend this empire or empirical control, this trading post empire, from not only the East African city-states and some control areas in Arabia along the Strait of Hormuz or near that in India. They're going to extend it to the Spice Islands or Indonesia, the Straits of Malacca or the Malaccas. So what we call today Indonesia and Malaysia and so forth. And this is going to be important because it's going to allow not only them to basically reap the benefits of the hegemony of the Indian Ocean, but they're going to control also the trade, any trade that can also move eastward to China and Japan, but also from Japan and China, if there's any. So that's a very important link here to understand, specifically here controlling the Strait of Malacca. So they have influence here, and then back on the east coast of Africa and the Strait of Hormuz. Very important for the Portuguese in their controlling of the Indian Ocean. All right, so here you can see this is the Portuguese at Malacca. Once they're able to control Malacca from the Arab traders that were ultimately in control there, they are, for all intents and purposes, this is the final brick that needed to fall for them to control Indian Ocean trade. All right, so more with the trading post empire the Portuguese had is they understood that they weren't a very big country. So instead of trying to control vast amounts of territory, they decided, all right, we're gonna use our abilities on the ocean plus our technology with cannon and are building technology in terms of forts to control the trade, because they realized if they control the trading areas, they, for all intents and purposes, also control the land areas, at least in some form. If they can control the money, then they're going to be able to tax all the other vessels. This is something that we've already talked about quite often, whether, it's really any group that we've talked about in our networks of exchange and so forth. If you go back to Srivijayan Empire, why were they able to become rich? It was not so much the amount of land they controlled, it was what they controlled and where they controlled it. And we're seeing this here with the Portuguese establishing control over trading areas. And you can see it here in the map. This is ultimately what will become the trading post empire for the Portuguese, with the main areas in the Indian Ocean being here the east coast of Africa, where they do establish control of land eventually. It's the one real kind of big area they do, at least on the east coast of Africa. The west coast, we're going to see what we know as Angola later on. You have some other areas they settle down into, but will ultimately lose to other European states. You have Cape Verde and so forth over here, in the Canary Islands and all this, not the Canary Islands, excuse me, the Azores, and then you have Sri Lanka or Ceylon, some various trading ports in India, and then you also have obviously the Moluccas in various places in the Spice Islands, and then trading influences in other places. Now, Brazil will become their crown jewel, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in this unit. Now, Portugal is going to be very vulnerable, and one of the reasons why they're going to be very vulnerable is just look at how spread out the empire is, and then also they're only focusing on various control of ports with forts. So as others get into this, there's going to be a vulnerability that they just can't protect everything. So even though they succeed, they're a small nation, so there's few workers and ships to enforce a larger empire. They do have a lot of merchants out there, but a lot of them are going to actually eventually go independent, which is going to hurt this whole trading institution, with specifically going back to the actual government. And then you have overall government corruption. And then once the Dutch and the English come into play, in specifically for the Dutch into the Indian Ocean, and the English eventually pretty much everywhere, they're going to lose control. And they're going to lose control not only because they lose specific places, such as the English taking over India, or the Dutch capturing Malacca and much of what we know today as Indonesia, and controlling that until the 1940s and 50s. It's also, they're going to lose it in the volume of ships within the trade too, with specifically the Dutch first, and then the English and others. Now we're going to move on to Spain. So Spain's our second case study here, because we can do a comparison between Portugal and Spain here. So that's why we're pairing them together. All right, so Spain, they're one of the big first ones we look at in terms of the explorers. Not just because, yes, we've talked about Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz with the Portuguese, but you have Christopher Columbus, you have Ferdinand Magellan and others, and you see them discover the New World under Columbus. And then you have Ferdinand Magellan, who is the first one to actually start a expedition that actually circumnavigates the globe. Now, even though Ferdinand Magellan doesn't live through this circumnavigation, it does have some lasting impacts. First one obviously being it's the first time somebody circumnavigated the globe in one expedition, but also from a territorial standpoint and a trading standpoint, you see the Spanish are able to gain a claim in Asia, specifically what we know as the Philippines, and they're going to hold on to this claim until they lose it to the United States in the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s. So the Spanish are going to gain control of the Philippines, and that's an important eastern area for them. All right, now we're going to look at their actual empire here on the map. This is what I'm talking about. They call it the Spanish East Indies. It's Spanish. It's not Portugal. It's the Philippines. Okay, and then we also have, there's some various other places that the Spanish are going to control in these areas. Sorry for the mouse going all over the screen. But then their main area that they're actually going to establish is as they move west, because of Columbus, they're going to gain control of a lot of areas in the Americas, specifically the northern and western parts of South America, pretty much all of Central America, and then the western part of North America um, as they build their empire. Okay. All right. So really, it's the lure of riches for them. So if you think about when we go back to our units when we talked about the American states in Unit 1, and a little bit in Unit 2, we have the Inca and the Aztecs. And when the Spanish come in contact with these cultures in the Americas, one in Central America with the Aztecs and the other the Inca in South America, they realize that they have a lot of the material wealth they want, specifically gold and then eventually silver. And as they start to control these areas, they start mining it. And they start subjugating these areas for not only gold and silver, but other resources such as sugarcane and tobacco, because they're very valuable crops. Now, this is ultimately going to have a really huge impact on the native population, not so much just the diseases that are going to run through and kill, the majority of these native populations, but the actual subjugation of these native populations by the Spanish for the gold and silver, as well as tobacco and sugarcane, are going to damage these populations beyond repair, and it's going to mean that they're going to need to bring in labor. And that is also a driving force behind why the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, takes off. All right, so now we're going to look at China and silver. So China and silver in relation to Spain. So because of the taxation system in China, they were actually very enthusiastic as once American silver was getting traded in the Indian Ocean in East Asian trade, because it's introduced there by the Spanish. And the taxing system in China meant that they could have access to a new resource that could help with the currency problem they had. And the Spanish are bringing it in. So you have silver that's coming from Mexico that goes to the Spanish Philippines, that's aboard the Spanish galleons, which are heavily armored ships, as you can see here. This is a galleon on the screen. And then they stop and exchange silver for luxury goods in either China or other areas that end up trading with China. And this becomes a mutual trading system. And ultimately, as time progresses, because of this trading and basically demand for silver in China, and then the material wealth of mercantilism, that force that's driving in Spain, ultimately what you're going to see is the Spanish over time are not going to adjust to the inflation that's going to happen in this trading system with silver, and it's going to do very well for them in the beginning, but they're going to start to fail as time goes on because they don't adjust their markets, they don't adjust for inflation and so forth. They just start feeding more and more into the system and then ultimately devalue it. Okay, so that's a problem for them. Now, one thing before we end here, I want to go back and talk about one key difference between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and this is a big thing to understand in our comparison. You notice I didn't use the term trading post empire for the Spanish, and even though I glossed over kind of their empirical stuff and didn't spend a lot of time on slides that said, all right, here's the Americas in this colony and this colony, you need to understand that the Spanish Empire is actually a colonized empire for the most part. It's going to be more focused on taking land, establishing control, setting up systems like the encomienda system. You're going to see a more mixture of the population. Slavery is going to take off more in these areas across their empire. And realistically, the only real kind of settled down empire, the empirical land that you're going to see with the Portuguese during this time as we continue, at least in this period, is going to be in Brazil, whereas the Spanish, you're going to see it obviously take off specifically in the Americas. So one key difference between Portugal and Spain is Portugal is more of a trading post empire that's focused on just controlling cities or trading ports and trading, and then the Spanish is more of our traditional colonial empire that's focused on actual colonization and expansion. All right, guys, that's all I got for you in our first set for 4.2, looking at our causations and events of exploration and looking at Spain and Portugal. Have a good one.